Okay. So as the title suggests, we're going to be talking about food allergies in children. This is my granddaughter, and I put this slide up for two reasons. One is it makes me happy to look at her, but the other is that she's dabbling in a little cow's milk triple cream there, so she's getting some fat, and there's some smoked salmon in the foreground that she's also been eating. And fortunately, Caroline doesn't have any food allergies. And nobody can really say why, at least not from a detailed mechanistic point of view. Allergists and immunologists do great work, and they're unraveling a lot of these mysteries. They're figuring out the mechanisms involved in the proper development of tolerance and when things don't go right, too. But nobody can piece things together and actually say this person will get it, or nobody can piece things together and say why a particular person does or doesn't have food allergies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about those mechanisms, but mainly I want to talk about more of a top-down approach. I want to use and develop theory, develop a hypothesis really for organizing and making sense of the mechanisms that we do know about and for the data that we do have bearing on childhood food allergies. So although this isn't an immunology talk, I do have to discuss a little basic immunology because it's sort of key as background for the hypothesis that I'm going to give you. The first thing you really need to know is that the immune system becomes armed and dangerous early. By armed and dangerous, I just mean that it's capable of doing great harm. But it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It begins in utero. It's pretty far along at birth, and it's nearly complete, shortly thereafter. Certainly, 1- and 2-year-olds have pretty good immune systems. Maybe not as good as a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old, but they're still their immune systems, if uncontrolled and attacking the wrong things, can do good damage. So what that implies is, from a very early age onward, that the immune system has to learn tolerance, and it has to learn it early. So really, these two things have to go hand in hand. They have to co-develop. Okay, so the two things that I've just told you are pretty much facts. Now I want to move more to a conjecture, but I think it's a solid one, and it is that the immune system learns tolerance best early. This is really important to my hypothesis. And so I'm going to take a few minutes to sort of, flesh it out a little bit. So there's one good general reason for why it's reasonable to believe that the immune system really does learn tolerance best at an early age. And that good reason derives from evolutionary life history theory. And it really is just sort of the idea that the force of natural selection is strongest early, and it doesn't really begin to decline until the typical age of first reproduction for whatever organism you're talking about. So any gene that comes along over evolutionary time that makes this immune system work better, and particularly its tolerance system work better, is going to be powerfully selected. And it's going to be powerfully selected even if it has downstream negative consequences. And that's because the weakening selection late discounts the negative effects that occur sufficiently downstream. So I don't want to go into this antagonistic pleiotropy theory of the evolution of senescence in any great detail, but it leads me now to discussing a more specific reason why I think the immune system learns tolerance best early. So let me flip down here and just say, first of all, that the tolerance is divided into two categories. There's central tolerance and there's peripheral tolerance. And both involve T cells in a very crucial way. So T cells are like, I call them the Leonard Bernsteins of the immune system. They don't do all the work, but they're the directors. They're the bosses, particularly helper T cells or CD4 positive T cells. So I want to explain to you how central tolerance works a little bit, and then get back to that former point where why I think the immune system's tolerance mechanisms work best if they work early. So white blood cells originate in the bone marrow generally, and if you're destined to become a T cell, you migrate into the thymus. The thymus begins with T, so that's where T cells get their name. And in the thymus, a whole bunch of things happen. And one of the most important things that happens is something called negative selection. And negative selection essentially means that if you don't pass that test, you're induced to die off, to commit cell suicide. And it works this way. So there are professional antigen-presenting cells within the thymus. T cells all have receptors that have specific configurations. So the antigen-presenting cell presents antigen, pieces of protein generally, that have a specific shape. And if the receptor fits with it and binds to it tightly, that triggers, as I said, cell suicide. And so those T cells never leave the thymus, and they don't get out into the periphery. Now, this system is really cool, and it really makes good sense, but only if the antigen being presented in the thymus is antigen that should not ever be attacked, right? So when I first heard that, like I said, I thought, wow, that's really a very neat system. And then I immediately thought, but there's a vulnerability here to the immune system. Because think of it this way. Think of a pathogen that gets into the thymus, and maybe it's a bacterium or a virus, and it somehow gets its protein coat or its antigens presented in the thymus. Well, what's going to happen, any T cell, and T cells, of course, are extremely important, any T cell that would react to that pathogen and be able to eliminate it would get deleted. And so that pathogen then would gain free reign, essentially, and that would be a huge advantage for the pathogen. So there's good reason to believe that there have been long-running evolutionary arms races between pathogens and hosts, and this is one of the focal areas where this arms race has been going on. And so this is why, as I said at the beginning, immunologists have a really hard time piecing everything together, and it's not because they're not extremely bright and doing great stuff, but it's because the immune system is so complicated. There's layer after layer of complexity, because pathogen does this, immune system counters. Pathogen does that, immune system counters. So there's all kinds of redundant and fail-safe things going on there. So now getting back to the point, why does this, what does it have to do with tolerance working best early? Well, when I was thinking about that vulnerability, and I spent a couple of years really thinking about it and trying to figure out how does the immune system deal with this. And it was in the middle of, I was an anthropologist first, and then at 39 I went to medical school. So it was, I don't know, maybe at the end of the second year of medical school when all of a sudden it occurred to me. What happened was I was in the habit of sneaking off into the library and into the journal reading rooms. We didn't have Google and all that back then. Nothing, things weren't online. And so this was in violation of medical school rules, because you're not really supposed to go off and think about things that are interesting to you. You're supposed to memorize yet another, Krebs cycle pathway or something like that. But anyway, it was on one of these forays that the idea came to me that in order to counter this vulnerability, the way you want to do it is when the thymus is most protected from outside threats, from these outside pathogens that can get in there and subvert the system. And when is that? It's when you're a fetus. It's when you're inside a uterus, wrapped in a couple membranes, separated from the rest of the world by a very picky placenta, and surrounded by an intact maternal immune system that's probably at its height of function at around the age when women are getting pregnant. And so that's the time you want this central tolerance mechanism working at full blast. And so I published this idea, and I really wasn't thinking about tolerance at the time. I was thinking more about, or food allergies at the time. I was thinking more about why the thymus involutes so early in the lifespan. It's a tremendously important immune system organ, but within months of birth, it's already, seen its better days. And by the time you hit puberty, it's a mere shadow of itself. And so that always seemed to be a real dilemma. You know, why would this important organ shrink up and go away so fast? I thought of it as being analogous sort of to ovaries in humans. You know, the rest of your organs when you're 60, 70, 80, if you take care of yourself, you know, they can be working pretty well, but ovaries, you know, lose their function early. And so a lot of evolutionary biologists, including me, have published articles on that too. But the answer here is a very different one. The reason we get early thymic involution, so I said in my published article, is because we needed to pull off this tolerance, what to attack stuff early. Selection's strong early. That selects for genes that have early positive effects to upgrade that function, and it tolerates downstream negative pleiotropic effects. And so, boom, it senesces out of tandem with every other organ in the body. Peripheral tolerance. Once a T cell exits the thymus, it's an effector T cell, and it can either, if it's a helper T cell, it can direct things. If it's a CD8 positive T cell, it can attack things. But it's somewhat dependent on the place you find yourself in the periphery. Some really cool studies have been done, one in 2010 published in Science and one in 2016 published in Science, on how all this works. And I just list those studies at the end of my talk because I don't really have time to go into them much. But basically what happens, if you're a T cell that gets through the negative selection process, you're out in the periphery, and you find yourself in the intraepithelial space of the small intestine, you're very inclined in that situation to have a phenotype change into a regulatory T cell, into what they call a Treg. And in that case, your function then is not to upregulate immune attack, but to downregulate it. So that's how peripheral tolerance tends to work. Okay, so that's all background. Now we want to talk for a minute about the problem. What I really want to address here is childhood food allergies and the fact that they've been increasing dramatically recently. You know, they go along like this and then boom. And it's all really happened in the last 2 or 3 decades. There's been a 50% increase in the US in prevalence of childhood food allergies just in the past 20 years. And these are US data primarily, but they apply pretty uniformly to all developed countries, you know, Europe and Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere. So if 50% isn't bad enough, there are some foods that are much worse. Since 1997, the prevalence of peanut allergy in children has gone up by over 300%. And that's significant because peanut allergies are severe. You know, they can be fatal, and they tend to be lifelong. You don't tend to outgrow them. Okay, so really, I'm focusing on explaining that rapid increase here. So here are, just so you know, the top 8 offending foods. These 8 foods cause over 90% of childhood food allergies. I have shellfish listed there, but really I probably should say crustaceans because the mollusks are not a problem generally. But you don't have to memorize this, but just I will be referring later in the talk to the 8. So let's go on. So now we're going to talk about, start developing the hypothesis. Now I want to talk about paleo diets. And there's a book I saw maybe on the website for this talk when I was exploring it called Paleo Diets for Dummies. Has anybody seen that one? Okay. Well, this is probably like the Cliff Notes version of Paleo Diets for Dummies, but it's pretty simple. But I like simple stuff, and I've really kind of had these rules in mind and lived by them personally for going on 3 decades now, and they've worked all right for me. But let me just kind of explain them to you. And I realize that many of you here know a lot more about paleo diets than I do. But I think one of the things that we can pretty safely say is that paleo diets were, they contained a lot of variety of foods. I heard somebody in one of the talks yesterday say 260 plant species in a given year or something like that. So, as foragers are opportunists, so they don't pass things by in general in most times and places. I mean, they might occasionally in times of abundance, but the point is we used to eat a lot of different things. So that's rule 1. The more important rule for my talk here today, though, is Rule 2, and it is that although we ate a lot of different things in the past, it was the same different things year after year, lifetime after lifetime. So, somewhat exaggerated form, I say there's no novelty. Well, there's novelty, but novelty gets introduced during our ancestry at very slow and infrequent rates on evolutionary timescales primarily. So, for example, as the flora and fauna that we consume evolve, then our diets would change and we would have some novelty from things like that. So stuff like climate change, which at least until recently was a slow process, was, those are things that would introduce novelty. Cultural innovations, once we learned to control fire, that would have opened up dietary possibilities, so novelty would have been introduced. But again, my point is that, if I were able to go back, or we were able to go back, to some hunter-gatherer foraging band living 100,000 years ago, if we went back 99,000 years ago, 1,000 years later, I think we would find that they're eating the same things. There would have been little change from over that 1,000-year period. So that leads to, ta-da, in red, as promised, Rule 3. If Rule 2 holds, then Rule 3 holds. And Rule 3 is that food antigen exposure from conception to about, I picked age 3 because I think tolerance works best early, matches exposure thereafter. Okay? Does everybody get that? If there's not a lot of novelty, then what you've been exposed to from your first minute on the planet as an embryo and then a fetus over the next several years is going to be what you're going to be exposed to primarily for the rest of your life. Now, exposure routes are placenta, breast milk, and then eventually maybe age 4, 5, 6 months, introduction of first solid foods. Now, surprisingly, we don't have a great characterization of what crosses the placenta in terms of food antigen or breast milk. We know a lot more about medicines that cross, for example, but we do know that a lot of them do. And peanuts, this great offender out there, is known to cross the placenta and cross through breast milk. So, some more work should be done on that. But in any case, if we're making sense up to that point, then here's the hypothesis. So first of all, keep in mind what I said about tolerance developing best if it develops early. And so then the hypothesis is because the immune system's tolerance mechanisms have evolved under the assumption that Rule 3 holds, actions that break Rule 3 should increase childhood food allergies, and actions that adhere to Rule 3 should decrease childhood food allergies. So really, I mean, it's a simple idea. So now we're going to talk about the things that broke the rules. So first of all, around 10,000 years ago, we got farming. Farming clearly, started to break Rule 1. We traded variety for a reliability of food source with farming. Farming in of itself, per se, maybe didn't cause problems with 2 and 3, but farming led to a whole lot of changes. So it led to settlements, larger populations, social structure changes, social hierarchies, and so on. You got settlements trading amongst one another, longer distances than ever before. You had more mobility to go along with that trade. You have technology coming along, the wheel and so on, to support that trade and the mobility. And then for the first time, really, you get the concept of wealth. I mean, hunter-gatherers aren't, they're known as egalitarian people. There's a little, some guy might have a little more than another guy and so on. But basically, wealth was a new concept that came up after farming and all this other stuff was going on. So before I talk about the last thing, though, I want to just say that and remind you that I'm trying to explain something that's happened really in the last 2, maybe 3 decades, this big surge in food allergies. And so it's not easy to take a variable that has been going on for 10,000 years or so. I mean, certainly, even 50, 60, 100 years ago, farming had spread to almost everywhere. We were pretty mobile. We had pretty good technology. There were wealth disparities, all those things. And yet, food allergies hadn't surged yet. So I need a bridging argument. And my bridging argument is this last thing. call it the age of information. It's also, some people call it the computer age. So basically, I'm blaming Google and Amazon and the Food Network and so on. So these two things correlate pretty perfectly. As soon as you're able to get on the internet and Google a recipe from a village in Cambodia, then we're starting to see these food allergies increase. So I want to go through just some kind of cartoon figures here of this. Let me see if I can get this. So I'm showing the way things used to be before farming, when Rule 3 was intact. We lived in relatively insular hunter-gatherer bands then. Now, I don't know exactly what the diameter of the circles are. You know, we're talking about 6 million years of hominin evolution here. It could be 20 miles one year, and it could be, 100 miles for another group. But the point is, you got hunter-gatherers living here, and they certainly interact with and trade food and information and technology with other hunter-gatherers living there. But if these guys are, living, say, in the forests of Europe 20,000 years ago, none of them were ordering out for Thai food. And vice versa for people living in, now modern-day Thailand. So more or less, you have this picture of these isolated, insular dietary regimes out there, I guess. Then things changed, the farming and all of that stuff, and the technology and the mobility and so on. And slowly but surely, we became less and less insular, not just in terms of diet, but diet's what we're focusing on here. But it was a fairly slow process. So I'm going to fast forward and try to illustrate with an anecdote. So I was born in 1953, and you can't see it there, but there's a little suburb just outside of Detroit. And it was semi-rural at the time, but it became more developed as time went on. And we all looked the same in my neighborhood. We all ate the same, sort of a corn-fed Midwestern diet. There were no ethnic restaurants in my neighborhood till I was at least 10. In fact, I remember when a Chinese restaurant came into town, and we could get this, very Americanized chicken chop suey once a month or something. But so all of that was happening, and we got to that point in 1953, and I don't think there's fine-tuned enough data to tease it out, but you might see a little more food allergy there. But I also want to point out this little circle that wasn't in the first slide or first picture. I call it the worldly group. Basically, they're rich people, real rich people. When I was a kid, I didn't know any of them. I didn't interact with any of them, but I knew that they were there. I mean, these were people who, they ate dinner in New York City, and then the next day they were in Europe, and a week later they were in Asia or South America. So these people really started to mix it up. And if they had kids, I would predict, that those kids were more likely to develop food allergies if they were of the right age. But as I said, we don't have data on that. So now, here we are now. So this worldly group, I don't mean we have all that many more rich people, but we're rich in terms of our access to information and our will to eat widely. We have Google, like I said. We have, I think in a couple of years, Amazon will drop off using a drone the ingredients from far-flung places for you, so you can eat widely. In my old neighborhood, whoops, what did I just do? In my old neighborhood there, filled with ethnic restaurants. There are families from all over the world living there now. A great, increase in cultural diversity, social diversity, all really, really wonderful stuff that probably most of us here applaud. But it has a downside with respect to food allergy in children. And the reason it does is we're in this particular time and space where there's still some people here who are eating just like I did in 1953. They're gestating their babies, exposing their babies, the fetus, to those narrow Midwest diets. They're exposing their babies through nursing, and they're exposing their babies with first foods to those narrow diets. But here's what's changed. This child can now walk down the block and eat lunch when he's 4 years old or she's 5 years old with a child from a whole different, a different culinary tradition, I guess, is what you would call it. So that, I think, is a setup for Rule 3 to really be broken. So, you've never had soy in your life for the first 3 years you've been on the planet, and then boom, you're in preschool sitting next to a kid who's eating tofu, and that's the risk. So, I mean, it's almost miraculous to me that we don't have more food allergies than we do because of the increased possibility for that type of mismatch. Okay, so how would we test this? Basically, here's the prediction. Mom avoids, you set up two populations. One would be where, maybe you would take a group of moms and you would say, eat a healthy diet, take your prenatal vitamin, and just that's it. That you don't really intervene. And then you take another group, the bottom group, and you experimentally make sure that those moms every day while pregnant, nursing, and while introducing foods, introduce most of the 8, so that on a weekly basis at least the kid's immune system is getting exposed to those 8 most offending foods. And then the prediction would be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out, those children in the bottom group, if my hypothesis is correct, should have far fewer food allergies. Now, unfortunately, this experiment's not been done, and I don't think it is being done, but we do have some hints of it, some partial data bearing on it, and we'll move to that now. So we'll focus on peanuts, but most of this can apply to some of the other foods on the 8 there too. But so in the year 2000, the American Academy of Pediatrics formalized the recommendation that pregnant moms, nursing moms, and moms with toddlers in the house should avoid giving those kids allergenic foods. Then in 2008, they said, well, wait a minute. We've been saying this, and everything's been getting worse, so maybe we shouldn't be saying this. There's really no good evidence for it. So they retracted all of those positions. And so here we are today. We're at a point where it's okay, if you eat peanuts when you're pregnant, but nobody's recommending you do it. The pediatricians aren't, allergists aren't. They stopped short of that. They have retracted the prohibition to age 3, and there is an evolving recommendation for early introduction of peanuts. But I have some position papers, and again, I put these at the end, that say, well, we're not quite sure, but in high-risk infants at least, maybe you should start introducing those foods early at 4 to 6 months and so on. So what prompted all of this change just in the last 2 years, in 2014 and 15, are some really good studies showing that one published in JAMA Pediatrics, the other published in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing that moms who ate peanuts during pregnancy had markedly reduced peanut allergies in their children. And another one published in the New England Journal that showed if you introduce those 8 foods early, 4 to 6 months of age, that those children have a markedly reduced risk of developing allergies to those foods. So we're starting to get, there's 2 good studies out there, only 2, and somehow they've overweighted. I mean, I could show you 7 different retrospective studies in the literature that said if you eat peanuts while you're pregnant, your kids are going to get peanut allergies and die. But that's the thing about data, it changes. We think of it as a gold standard, and I'm not against data, but it's how we interpret data. And now all of a sudden we're interpreting it differently. And I don't really know what's caused the shift in allergists and pediatricians' thinking. It's not that they thought about Rule 3 being broken, I can tell you that. But it is, I think, that they first said the rule, avoid these things, because I don't think it's any more complicated than they said peanuts are bad, let's not eat peanuts. And then later they said, well, geez, this isn't working. And some people noticed, well, in Israel, kids eat peanut butter early and they have fewer peanut allergies. So they started to piece some things together. But I think, let me just say, I think I'm running out of time, so I don't want to go too much further. But I thought of this hypothesis many, many years ago. But all the data went against it. If I had tried to publish it or tried to, give a talk on it, I probably would have been rejected because they would have cited the 7 studies that said, Turke, you're crazy. In the last couple of years with the data coming out, I felt, I've started to publicize this idea a little bit, because I think if we have a framework, if we have a theory that makes sense of data that goes along with, I guess in detective stories, you have the data, but you also need the motive. So I'm trying to put those two things together. So, I'm not, we're going to have to see how this plays out. I'm not anti-data. We need to have data. We need to test this better. But basically, I'm pretty confident now, and I advise this to my daughter and our granddaughter, eat that stuff early and introduce it early. So I'm not trying to explain everything. Hygiene hypothesis comes into play here, but I just don't think the hygiene hypothesis can, although it's important for the development of tolerance and immune function, both versions of it, the worms and the old friends. I don't think that we suddenly eradicated worms in 1997, and I don't think we suddenly started abusing antibiotics only in 1997. So they lay the background for, set the stage for food allergies, I think, but I don't think they explain the recent surge. And again, there's all kinds of other things going on. You can be 30 and develop a food allergy, and I don't know why. It has nothing to do with Rule 3, I don't think. But anyway, as clinicians, as people who are interested in health and well-being, there's all kinds of balancing acts that we have to deal with. I mean, I think the heavy guy there is mainstream medicine. He's weighted down by a lot of data. The lightweight guy there is theory. We need to fatten him up. We don't need to necessarily put that guy on a diet. We need to fatten theory up so they can make better sense of their theories. And if you're a clinician, you have to tread that, that tightrope like I was talking about. I'm a free speech guy, and I love speculation. I love speculative ideas and hypotheses. But we have to remember that with the internet, if I say something crazy, and I have, and somebody reads it, and they say, well, I'm going to do that because Turke said to do it, and then somebody dies, if you're a string theorist, you don't have to worry about that stuff. But we do. So, but I think that, as I said here, the talks I've heard have all been wonderful, and people are bringing the data, and I think everybody's being very responsible in the way they're presenting it. So I'll stop there. Sorry for going a little over. Okay. Okay. What? Yeah, I'll come up for questions, please.
Hi. So if the mom's a vegan and she's not feeding at least 4 of those 8 during pregnancy, would you expect a radically increased amount of childhood sensitivity?
Well, I mean, I would expect an increase. I think she's putting the child in that situation, I believe, is at risk if the child then goes outside the natal home and has a non-vegan exposures. So yes.
Thank you for a great talk and educating me about all of these things.
Thank you.
I'm curious to know if you have a hypothesis about why the 8 are those 8 foods, and whether it's true that corn is becoming number 9.
Corn is up there. I think sesame seeds is probably the one that's going to displace, make it into that list. So it's 2 things that are happening here. So the food has to be intrinsically allergenic. It has to have properties. So proteins are more allergenic in general than lipids, for example. So it has to have some intrinsic allergic potential, but it has to be eaten in sufficient enough quantity in the place or the country in order to break into the top 8. So like I said, sesame seeds may be the most allergenic food out there, but if nobody eats, tahini or sesame seeds, it's not going to break into the top 8. I don't know where corn is on the list. I think it's in the top 14. Okay.
Very interesting hypothesis.
Thanks.
I'm curious, not to contradict what you've been saying, but
Oh,
I'm
go ahead.
curious-
That's fine.
Curious how you feel about leaky gut and how, possibly wheats or grains and dairy may cause leaky gut, and then the association with the undigested proteins being associated with something like strawberries or, other
Yeah,
things
well,
as
I
far
mean,
as causing.
Yeah, I think that that's an issue, and I wouldn't recommend that you feed your children a whole bunch of wheat and things like that. I think, though, that again, like the vegan situation, if that maybe exposing them to it a little bit, the immune system. That's the cool thing about it. You don't need to drink a gallon of malaria parasite in order to get your immune system to recognize it. You only need a little bit. So you can probably put some in and expose the child to it without necessarily really exacerbating the leaky gut phenomenon.
So without making it a primary part of the diet, just a little bit of exposure.
Exactly.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks.
Yep.
Would it follow from your hypothesis that we should have individualized ancestral diets based on our own particular ancestry?
I suppose you could tease that out. Basically, I'll refer you back to Rule 3. So whatever so you're working in two things. You're working in sort of a diachronic argument with a synchronic argument. I'm looking at what happens in mom and then baby, next generation, and if those two diets match well, I'm saying you're pretty safe. I think you're saying that if you're of an ancestry that ate certain types of foods, natural selection over the long run should have minimized the potential for those foods to become allergenic. And so that would cause me to answer your question.
Okay.
Yes.
I have one more question,
Yeah.
actually. Are you familiar with the work of Catherine Nagler?
I don't think so.
Her lab has done some work it's been on mice, but they reversed a peanut allergy in mice by introducing a Clostridium species to the mouse. And so I think in conjunction with your hypothesis, that decreasing the diversity of our gut microbiota has a big...
I think so too, and I think that's very important. And doctors being the way they are, if you read these consensus reports, they'll say, there's no real evidence for that, and blah 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 blah. But I mean, to us, people who are thinking more broadly about it, I would overweight a study like that. I would say, that's probably not something I'm going to discount. So I really think there is room for that.
Yeah.
Also, I should say along those lines, I may have been a little too cavalier in saying, well, I don't think, the old friends hypothesis can really account for the surge in the last 20 years. But I heard a talk recently where you get this ratchet effect. So you lose species as you go. And so it may be that you cross a threshold, and now all of a sudden it is the loss of old friends that's contributing to that
Right,
surge.
and if mom lost those species, it's
Yeah.
unlikely that you're going to have them.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. So we're down to a minute of questions left.
Thank
I'll
you.
try to, okay, thank you. Yep.
Yes. Apropos of the old friends hypothesis and testing that versus yours, specifically on peanut allergies, I read in Moises Velasquez Manoff's book, An Epidemic of Absence, which I really liked, two things about peanut allergies. One explanation is that women were using creams for babies that had peanut oil in it, and so if you're exposed on
Right.
the surface of your skin versus internally,
Right.
that makes a difference. The other is that you can actually overcome it by sublingual allergen immunotherapy. So how would you explain those two facts with your hypothesis?
Well, I mean, I think the sublingual thing, it fits with my hypothesis because you're desensitizing, through the peripheral tolerance mechanism pathway. The sensitization has to do with through not just through creams, but even just smelling it can presumably sensitize children to it. And it has to do with, see, the immune system, these cells, T cells in particular, react differently depending on where they are. So we have to have a system in place in the gut, because we all got to eat, so we got to have some regulation going on down there. Whereas the regulatory mechanisms and the tolerance mechanisms in the skin, skin faces far different problems from the gut. So I don't find that, to be, really a problem for my hypothesis. Interesting, though.
Thanks very much.
Hi.
I'm getting flashed a stop sign. I'm not sure what to do. One
Okay.
more? Okay.
It's a question contradiction. I'm Russian and I work with a lot of Russian population here in US and in Russia. The potato is the food that it's like a national food for us, and a lot of generation ate potato. But now I see my functional doctor noticed that, and I see in my practice, a lot of Russian are intolerant to potato. They have allergy or intolerance. And it's potato. It's the food that generation ate, and we grew up, it was our first food.
Right.
So why? I mean, it's very contradictory to what you were saying.
Well, I don't think it is. I think it's a prediction. I mean, I almost put that, not for the potato, but for populations who are immigrating in from one country where they have one dietary cuisine to this country or another country where they have a different one. I may be cherry picking the data, but there's a big study out there showing that immigrants tend to have lower incidence of food allergies overall, but there's one group, and that's young children who were gestated, breastfed, and introduced to first foods in the old country, and then they move here, and in those first 2 or 3 years of life, that's the group that surges higher than anybody else. Yeah, so that's so those data, I think, are very consistent with the hypothesis.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.